Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tortoise ThinkIn with Lisa Nandy. When we started Tortoise and we launched nearly 2 years ago, tomorrow evening we'll be celebrating our second birthday. When we launched Tortoise, one of the things that we had in mind was, is there a way of developing new formats in the news? And we've thought and talked a lot about stories and storytelling, narrative journalism. But actually, what's crept up on us is that we have a genius in our midst in the form of Mark St. Andrew. And I don't know whether we're allowed to spotlight Mark St. Andrew, who's the person who sits behind the scenes and chooses the music for every ThinkIn. And so the reason that we start a ThinkIn with Morris looking suitably embarrassed here, the reason we've started a ThinkIn and what I hope will be a conversation about Britain's place in the world and the state of Labour politics with Toxic by Britney Spears is Mark.
It's Lisa Nandy's favourite song, and I found it. She cites it in a lot of interviews, and I was going to pick a cover because I like to be too clever by halves, but it's actually Liz Mosley who talked us into playing the original.
Very good. All right. Well, Mark, thank you very much. So that's what we've got. It's not the news set to music, but the news explained by music. And I'm delighted that Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, is here. I know, Lisa, you had to literally run into the house with the laptop and get there. So thank you for joining us. The nature of this is that it's intended to be like an open news meeting, as if you walked into our newsroom. I'm very on message here with my branding. As you can see, no expense spared at Tortoise. We've taken this little pennant, but the idea of Make the News was that everyone would be able to join into an open news meeting and weigh in with what they think matters. So I'm going to have some questions and thoughts for you, but I know that lots of other people are joining us want to do the same. So my colleague Liz Mosley, who Mark just mentioned, is here in the chat. She's going to try and sort of flag up points that people make, and in the course of the hour, and we're grateful for your time, we'll have the chance to sort of think through and understand, I hope, both where you see Labour today, but also where you see Britain today. But before we get that, let's ask and address this question of where you see Britney today. So I don't know whether you saw Framing Britney Spears, but this is obviously a thing that you're famous for. What did you make of Framing Britney Spears?
Well, I can't believe you started with Britney Spears. Just genuinely can't believe it. It's brilliant. This is probably the best town hall meeting I've ever attended.
We may never get off Britney Spears. The truth.
Well, this is the trouble. I don't know how serious you are, and I have a lot to say about this subject. So some of you will know, and some of you will not know, but I have loved Britney Spears since Baby One More Time. I am a great fan and have followed her closely over the years. I've been to every UK tour she's ever done. I wanted to go and see her in Vegas, but I never made it, unfortunately, because I had a baby, and so life intervened. But I've been following this story very closely, and I'm someone who has watched very troubled in the way in which Britney has been portrayed over the years, and lots of women in the public eye. Any kind of relationship that she's in, she's portrayed in one way and the man is portrayed in another, completely different standards that she's held to, just like most women in the public eye. Lots of commentary on her appearance, on her weight. I don't quite know how she and others do it, really, because politics, in politics you get a bit of this, but it's nothing like the level of exposure that they get. And so I watched it in increasing amounts of horror about how, this legal sort of network had closed in around her. But, my colleague Jess Phillips wrote a really interesting piece for Politics Home a few days later. And, Jess is one of those people who always makes me think. One of the reasons I love my job is because I get to be around a lot of people who do make me think and often make me think differently. And she said, the problem with this Framing Britney Spears documentary is that it's portrayed as pro-Britney, but it doesn't have Britney's voice in it. And there are lots of reasons for that, speculation about whether she can speak or not. But just yesterday, Britney did post on Instagram that she'd been crying since the documentary, because she'd been framed in lots of different ways over the years and judged in lots of different ways. And she was suggesting that this documentary was part of that chain. So well done, Jess, for calling it right. You know, her point is that if we genuinely want to have a debate about how we change this situation and this settlement for women, then it has to start with women's voices. And actually, you know, I read it and thought, is that right? Is that why Britney's not talking? Actually, you know, once again, Jess called it right, I think.
Lisa, thank you. I really do sense that we could talk about this for a good while longer.
I've got views on Taylor Swift as well, if you want any.
By the way, so you think what?
I think she's wonderful. And don't get me started on Beyonce, because she's an absolute idol.
So this is a whole other. We're not in desert island discs, but we're definitely drifting in that direction. Let's start, if we can, though, Lisa. You know, you were in that. You went to go and speak to that group of fellow Britney Spears, Chatham House, today, to talk about Britain's place in the world. And actually, for those people who didn't hear the speech, I think it's quite a good place to start, because do you want to just set out the argument, and then if I might, I'm going to have a go at trying to understand the key issues in it.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you know, over the last 12 months since Keir appointed me as Shadow Foreign Secretary, I have to say it was a bit of a surprise and a relief. I had thought possibly, having stood against him in the leadership contest, I might have been put into a cupboard for the rest of the parliamentary session. And it was really nice when he reached out and, you know, big generous offer, and said, when we said we're a team, we meant it. And I hope you can see that we do work as a team and we really enjoy it. And, you know, I started off by thinking there are some things that we've got to do pretty quickly. We've got to reset our position in the Labour Party in a few key areas, particularly in relation to Russia, where I've said before that we got it badly wrong in relation to the Skripal attack. In relation to China as well, I think the government has been you know, far too keen to roll out the red carpet to Beijing over the last decade, and in the process of doing so has been content to turn a blind eye to human rights abuses. I think we had to reset on that, and I think we've been very successful. And Keir and I have also been reaching out to world leaders who share our view that democracy at home and democracy abroad is absolutely the priority, especially now post-COVID, when we've seen what happens when the world pulls together and also what happens when the world pulls apart. So that was a top priority, is, you know, getting out on the front foot and doing all of those things. But today, what I set out was really what drives me and drives us in relation to foreign policy and will drive a future Labour government. And it's this gulf between foreign policy and domestic policy, the way in which the two things are treated as completely separate. The debates never really colliding, at least not in my experience over the last 12 months and actually over the last 11 years as the MP for Wigan. And it's my view that this gulf has now become a real threat to Britain's prosperity and security. It means that we don't have broad support and consent for what we do overseas amongst the British people, but it also means that we've missed the fact that foreign policy is just simply not delivering, and at times is actually causing devastation for many people and for their communities across the United Kingdom, and that it will be the mission of the next Labour government to change that. And you know, the sort of diagnosis that I've got, I suppose, in a nutshell, is that we've been far too relaxed about a global system that has deregulated and liberalised markets. This is not an argument to turn the clock back to the 1970s. We live in a global world. But if we live in a global world, then we've got to make sure that that global settlement works for working people, because if it doesn't work for working people here and across the world, it simply isn't working. And far too many communities have seen their wages depressed, they've seen jobs offshored, they've seen entire communities written off as a consequence. So when you walk down the high street in a place like Wigan or in Hartlepool or in Rotherham, what you see on that high street is a direct consequence of a a domestic agenda and a global agenda that has stripped those places of good quality jobs, of working age population, of young people, of spending power. And all of that you see in the cancelled bus networks and on the high streets, and in the real anger amongst many of the people who live there about the settlement that they've been handed. So it's my view that foreign policy and domestic policy has to come together once again, and we've got to reach out and work with our allies around the world in order to change that.
And Lisa, you know, you quote the historian C.L.R. James that genuine internationalism must be based on the national scene. I see Tess Murray in the chat has said, is it time for a rerun of Robin Cook's ethical foreign policy? Actually, when you read your speech, it sounds much more like a domestic foreign policy. It's rooted in an idea of what it delivers to people in the UK. I think a lot of people will read that analysis and hear what you're saying this evening and say, yes, we completely agree with that. When they get to the second half of the speech, this idea of a new economic statecraft, that's when they, or at least certainly I, when I read it, thought, well, what does that actually mean?
So I went into a little bit of detail, but I don't know if Robin Niblett at Chatham House would have let me get away with a 2-hour PowerPoint thesis. And I am a little plug for Prospect here. I am following up with a long read in Prospect, which will be out in the next edition, to put a bit more flesh on the bones of that. But I tried to set out a few of the ways in which we might set about doing that. I mean, the first is that we want to see a different trade policy. So an approach to trade that is based not just on markets, but on fairness, that works with trade unions and like-minded governments in order to protect labour rights and lift those standards through the trade agreements that we make. But trade is only one part of it. I mean, tax is often treated as a purely domestic agenda, but actually the global tax agenda is just as important, because we have a settlement that allows money to be sucked out of the country, sucked out of local communities. And as a consequence, those communities are starved of not just investment in public services, but investment in infrastructure, investment in young people as well. So I want to see us working with our allies in order to try and change some of the features of the global system that has gone wrong. And I think there's a real opportunity to do it. I think this is a growing agenda across the European Union and elsewhere. But I also want to see us getting on the front foot and thinking, what can we constructively do to drive investment into those areas? And one of the things I mentioned in the speech was a future-based partnership with the United States, not just a relationship based on nostalgia, but the Biden White House really does offer an opportunity for us to partner in an area that we are particularly good at around research and new technology and clean energy. Now, why shouldn't young people in towns like Wigan and Barnsley be doing the clean energy jobs of the future, designing battery technology? These are communities that once powered the world within living memory, and they could power us through the next generation, just like their parents and grandparents powered us through the last. And that's the sort of agenda, frankly, that I think people in constituencies like mine have been waiting to hear for a very, very long time. They saw the system was broken long before we did, and they've been waiting for somebody to give voice to that in the political system.
I think that's right, Lisa, but the question I've got for you is whether or not what you're proposing, so a trade policy that really takes to its heart labour standards and environmental standards, or a tax policy that deals with tax evasion and avoidance on an international scale, is really a new economic statecraft. Because I think people for years in different ways have been saying we need to address those issues. The real question, it seems, is whether or not Labour buys into the project of globalization and free movement of capital, free movement of technology, free movement of people in order to get the best possible outcomes, or you have a different vision for the way in which the world economy should work.
Well, I don't accept the idea that there's one model of globalization. I think we live in a global world. Not, the most compelling example I've seen of that recently is that Jonathan and Ashworth and I have been meeting with scientists who've been cooperating through the World Health Organization in order to find the treatment, diagnostics and vaccines that the world needs. These are Chinese scientists, US scientists, European scientists, and British scientists, as well as from many other countries around the world. And they've been doing that even as the global politics got more and more toxic, and as the costs and the risk to them and their families got even greater. I think there are models of globalization and global cooperation that don't rely on the idea that we're constantly pitted against one another, that for some to win, others have to lose, and that the only way that you can get ahead is to drive other people down. I think we can do better than that. And I think what's interesting in the way that the Biden administration's agenda is emerging in the United States is that I think even more so than under Barack Obama or the plans put forward for Hillary Clinton, I think there is a really strong recognition in the Democratic Party now that that is the case. It's not just something we'd like to do, it is absolutely fundamental and essential. We cannot continue with a system where you have these grand visions for Britain over here and you have the people over there. We saw what happens with that during the Brexit vote. You know, when you don't bring the two together, the thing breaks apart, and we've got to change that.
So Lisa, can we take one example of this where there's an intersection of values and principles that you talk about, and there's the issues of economic impacts, right? And just focus for a few minutes, if we might, on China, right? Some practical questions. If you're the Foreign Secretary, given what you see happening in Xinjiang and the policies that the Chinese government is meting out to the Uyghurs, do you think that the UK should boycott the Winter Olympics in China next year?
Well, look, first of all, I do share the concerns of the Foreign Secretary and various others about not just using or singling out sport to make political statements. But that having been said, I think there's a real problem with the Beijing Olympics because, you know, one of the things that we know very much about China is that the Chinese government is looking for recognition and status on a world stage. And so I think we ought to be very, very careful about going and providing that status to the Chinese government through the Beijing Olympics. And one of the things that we have been pushing the Foreign Secretary to do, he was pushed about it at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee as well recently, is to lay out a number of areas that we want to see China make progress on, particularly in relation to Xinjiang, although Hong Kong is also clearly another compelling issue, before we would be prepared to go and give the Chinese government a PR coup. So one example, and the most pressing example, is to allow UN inspectors access to the Xinjiang province. The reason that what is happening in Xinjiang hasn't been recognised as a genocide, except by a handful of countries, is because in order to meet the legal threshold for genocide, the evidence has to be gathered. The evidence can't be gathered because the Chinese government is blocking access to Xinjiang. We have got to make this an overwhelming priority. And in my view, we ought to be saying to the Chinese government, we will not give political support to the opening ceremony unless that condition is met.
So that means that the British athletes would attend, but the British government wouldn't. Is that what
That's
you mean?
right? Yeah. So the political support for the opening ceremony, I think, has got to be withheld if the UN inspectors haven't been given access to Xinjiang. But I think we ought to be making that clear to China now. It is in the Chinese government's interests that the Beijing Olympics are a success. And I think it's really important we make that clear to them now and see if we can get movement on this very, very important issue.
Right. Let's take another aspect then of the China relationship. These are universities and investment in research. Right? There's obviously been a pendulum swing in the last decade. 10 years ago, British universities were welcoming, encouraging Chinese investment. Now there seems to be skepticism about whether that investment is safe. Do you think that we should actively deter investment from Chinese companies and Chinese state-owned companies? And do you think we should deter Chinese students from coming to British universities because they risk leaking our intelligence, our intellectual property back into China?
Well, just down the road from here in Manchester, not very far from where I'm sitting at home in Wigan now, we've got a huge Chinese student population, or at least we did until COVID. And I think we'll have again when things go slightly more back to normal. And they are important. They're not just important to the university, but those cultural exchanges have always been important, just as it's important that we send people over to study and to work in China and across the Indo-Pacific region. And I think we need to be clear that our concerns about the Chinese government are a quarrel with the Chinese government, not with the Chinese people. The relationship between the British people and the Chinese people is long, deep, and it's important. And, sometimes in this debate, I think it strays very much in some parts of the political system into xenophobia. And I absolutely and utterly reject that. I think those cultural exchanges are very important. I've seen for myself, as I mentioned before, with the World Health Organization, just how important those scientific collaborations are as well. But the universities do present a real challenge because of Chinese state laws, because of national security considerations. And I think we have to be far more robust about national security. I think we need to, when we're looking at Chinese investment, we need to have a national security assessment of that investment and make sure it passes that threshold. We should not be in a situation where our own security services are saying that investment in 5G, for example, poses a risk and the government is still trying to plough ahead with that investment. We've been talking to our counterparts over in Australia, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong, about this, because obviously Australia has had real challenges in relation to this for a lot longer than the United Kingdom, and has really been at the sharp end of some of the pressure coming from the Chinese government as well. So we've been talking to them about what more we could do here in the United Kingdom. But I do think, as difficult as it is, in this sort of very politically sort of black and white world that we inhabit, to say that the cultural exchanges are important, but we've got to be tougher on national security. I do think that is the right approach. The way I heard William Hague describe it a while ago, just generally in relation to our relationship with China, is something I very much support, a twin pillar approach where we cooperate with China on areas of shared concern, COVID, climate change. There's no global problem that can be solved without the active involvement of the Chinese government, but that we do that from a position of far greater strategic independence. And that means working with allies, providing alternatives to nuclear, investment in nuclear, investment in 5G and other areas where national security could be put at risk.
We could probably talk just about China as well, but I wanted to come to the national scene if we can, what's happening in the UK. And actually, it wouldn't be a bad thing just to start where we are today. What did you make of the report from the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities on institutional racism, or the absence of it, as they suggested, in the UK today?
So hands up, it came out at 11:30 and I've been on the go ever since. I am starving, not that you need to know that, but I'm so hungry. I may have to order a pizza while this is going on. But so I haven't read it. All I've seen is the briefings that came out last night and were briefed into the media for this morning. I have to say I was really disappointed with the way in which it was briefed. I don't know if that reflects the whole report, but I think one thing that the briefings seemed to seek to do was to undermine the idea of structural racism. They seem to take aim at this idea that sort of set up this, it almost felt like a straw man, really, this idea that Britain is an institutionally racist country, when actually the debate about racism and the very many reports about discrimination, inequality and racism that the government has commissioned over the years have very much been about structural racism in institutions rather than structural racism as a country. And I'm just not really sure how the Commission reached the conclusion that there is no structural racism when you look at the fact that during the COVID pandemic, Black and minority ethnic people were far more likely to die of COVID. When you look at some of the statistics in those reports about the criminal justice system, about the workplace, about the seniority that people who are from particular ethnic minority backgrounds are able to reach, but generally, I'm just not sure how they reached that conclusion. And I think the reason I'm so disappointed by it is because I think, what this does is create more frustration amongst people who would really like to see us move on and sort this out. I think it creates a lot of division. I think it creates a debate that actually takes us backwards, not forwards. And what I'd really like to see is all those reports sitting on the government shelves that they've commissioned over the last 5 years. I'd just like to see them take them down, dust them off, get out the recommendations and implement them.
Right. Well, I think, I mean, there's quite a lot of debate, and I wanted to open up because I think people will have views about exactly this, Lisa. But I suppose we're slightly tiptoeing around you on foreign policy, the government's response to COVID and today's report. I think for a lot of people, the central question is this, and I'm going to bring in, if I might in a moment, Jason Nisse, and I can see that Althea Bowman's got her hand up too, is this question about why it is where, given what's happening in the country, given the government's record on COVID, you still see a situation, or you see a situation in which the Conservatives are, depending on the polls, 5 to 7 points ahead. And that for some reason, despite what you say about a new team coming in place, it's not working. And why is it, you think, that Labour and Keir Starmer's team is not landing a message that's working?
I mean, I find this a little, it's only because I've answered this question a lot today that I'm finding it a little frustrating, and it's completely fair that you ask. It's just that I think people think that, I just think I think people think that when I say this, I'm saying it because I'm supposed to say it, but I do actually mean it. That 12 months ago, or just over 12 months ago, we lost our entire Labour base in every nation and region of the United Kingdom. I'm one of the people who saw it coming. It was absolutely shattering. That I'll never forget that night as long as I live, and I never, ever, ever want to be there again. And when you look at where we were then and where we are now, of course, I won't be happy until not just that we're ahead in the polls, but until we're in government and actually making good on the promises, the sort of promises that I started making today and that Keir started setting out a few weeks ago in his economic speech. But, in that time, in that 12 months, one of the things that I got a pretty close seat to this in the leadership contest. One of the things that Keir promised to do was to sort out anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. We cannot claim to go out and fight for a fairer, more equal society if we can't even get that right in our own party. And he's absolutely set about doing that and earning back the trust. He hasn't won back all the trust. We haven't collectively, but we have absolutely set about doing that and earning back the trust of people that it cost us. And on top of that, he said he would build a very broad team drawn from every tradition in the Labour Party, and he has. I can tell you that in 11 years, I've never felt part of a team that was as determined to get into government as I do now. Now, I think there are some particular circumstances why there's a difference in the polls. On top of the fact that we've got a mountain to climb and we've got to earn back people's trust. Not least the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I'm not sure quite how many people are paying that much attention to what the opposition is saying or doing. But I can't make an apology for that. I just feel, when the vaccine rollout was a success, I was absolutely delighted and relieved in equal measure. We want the government to get this right. And where they don't get it right, we will challenge them. And we do, Nick Thomas-Symonds on borders, Keir on the circuit break, Annalisa Dodds on sick pay. We will go out and challenge them on those things, but we'll make constructive suggestions in the hope that very quickly they'll get it right. And if that means that they get a bounce in the polls and we come out of COVID quicker, it's just the responsible thing to do. I don't know how we could seek government in a few years' time if we hadn't behaved with the utmost integrity through this crisis.
Lisa, let me bring in Jason Nisse. Had a question you won't see because there's such a torrent of chat, but Jason, why don't you put the point to Lisa? I should just tell people, if you're new to a ThinkIn, we have a loosely enforced rule, which is no questions. We want to hear people's points of view and invite Lisa to respond to them. So it's loosely enforced, and particularly loosely enforced on Zoom, because what am I going to do? But Jason, over to you.
Thank you. First off, Lisa, I'd like to say that I actually voted for you in the leadership election. And as a Jewish person who lives in Jeremy Corbyn's constituency, I had actually left the Labour Party, and I had actually not voted Labour for the last 2 elections because I was so concerned about the way he was taking the party. Had you won, what would you have done differently?
I thought, oh, horrible question. Hang on, you're not allowed to ask questions.
there's a proviso that with Lisa, if it's a really good question, you can ask it, and that was.
Okay, so I mean, it's possible I would have done things differently. I mean, everyone comes in with their own sort of background and experience, but I guess I do find it a genuinely difficult question to answer. And I suppose the reason is, I saw someone post in the chat, like, oh my God, is her foreign policy all about towns? You know, we've mentioned Britney, we've mentioned buses, we've mentioned towns already on this chat. I suppose, you know, one of the things about today is that you've seen me go out and make a case for a foreign policy that is rooted in the themes that I was talking about in the leadership contest, that not only I care about, but I genuinely believe Keir cares. I mean, he messaged me just now, actually, having just caught up with the sort of final version of the speech. And it's something he cares about, it's something I care about. It's something that during the process of the leadership contest, actually, I feel quite proud about. We had a contest of ideas. You know, Becky, Keir and I, we were competitors, but we were never opponents. And she, you know, pushed very hard on ideas like the Green New Deal. I was pushing very hard on the need to reconnect with people in communities around the country. And, you know, Keir really wanted to unite the party. He just felt that unless we could show that we could do this in our own party, we would never win permission to tell the British people that we could do the same. And actually what you got out of that, and out of the way that we handled that contest, is you got a leader who came out strengthened by the process rather than weakened by it, which is what I'd seen in every leadership contest before. And you got a team that was able to take the best of all of those things and present them to the country. And that's what I was doing today. And you know, so I guess I just feel that we're in a good place. It's not that we haven't got more to do. It's not that we're not more ambitious. It's not that we're not, you know, that we're not relentless about saying we have got to form the next government, because we absolutely have. But I do genuinely think we're in a good place about that. I think we're taking the best of different parts of the Labour Party and actually pulling in the same direction for once. You know, we're not uniform, but we are united. And the distinction between those two things is really important to me.
Lisa, Althea Bowden's had her hand up for a bit. Althea, do you want to weigh in? I'm going to bring in Media Scurry in a second.
Me?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Well, hi. I'm a newcomer to the UK. I came to marry someone, but I'm from the United States of America, and I just want to say that you know, I grew up there and observed the elections for all my life, and to some, I think it was kind of a lulling of the elections to have the parties kind of equally represented over time, Republican, Democrat. And it is good in a sense to only have two parties, because if you have too many parties, of course, it divides the whole country. But the thing is, the elections, they were way too regular. And so I suspected that there was still some sort of corruption, to be honest with you, in regards to the election process as I grew up. But my point with you specifically, Miss Nandy, is that you need to be very careful if you want the UK to progress in terms of its decisions, in terms of deals that you make with the United States, even though I would love to see Britain's progress be made wherever it's gone.
Althea, thank you. It's such a big, I mean, by the way, this is such a big issue, isn't it, for Labour, the nature of the relationship with the United States. But would you, Althea, forgive me, I've only interrupted, Althea, just because your line's breaking up a little bit. So I just thought I'd invite Lisa just to give your version of what you think the UK-US relationship should be.
Well, I mean, first point I'd make is that I think it's got to be future focused and not based on nostalgia. That, you know, when I talk to friends and counterparts, particularly in our sister party over in the United States, there is a there is a concern that the UK government isn't clear about what it wants out of that relationship, whereas they're getting a very strong steer from France, from Germany, and from others about how they want that partnership to develop. It's not entirely clear how the UK wants to see that relationship develop, except in relation to defence and security, which has been and persists as a very strong and stable relationship between our two countries. I guess the other thing that I said today in the speech that I made to Chatham House is that, and one of the differences between us and the government is that, you know, we see the relationship with the European Union and with European countries as incredibly important to that. We want, you know, you can overstate this, but we did once act as a bridge between Europe and America. That is clearly no longer the case. If you look at when John Kerry came over recently, he came over to London and met with UK counterparts, but he also had a meeting with European leaders to discuss their shared agenda for COP26. This is a global conference that we are co-hosting in the autumn, and we weren't even in the room to discuss that shared agenda. That is a real problem, I think, for the United Kingdom. And so I think we need to pursue both the United States and the European Union, and I think and bilateral relations with European countries. I think that's how we're stronger. And I think that is a key difference between us and the government. There was a Europe-sized hole in the Global Britain policy that was published last week.
Lisa, that's really interesting. It's a really interesting point, and it was quite noticeable how absent that was in the integrated review. Can I also just ask something which I suppose touches on your Chatham House speech, on the point Althea is making about the UK-US relationship, but also the point that Jason was raising around strategy for Labour, which is the relationship with the legacy, reputation, record of Tony Blair in government. And you will have seen that, I think Alistair Campbell tweeted that the record of Labour in the last, generation was lose, 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 Blair, 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 lose, lose, lose. And I wonder what you think of that.
Well, I mean, I think objectively that's true. And I also think that there's, we've got into this, it's partly the way in which the political debate has progressed in this country over the last decade, this sort of idea that you can be, for X or against it, and you can't take a nuanced view about anything. I think we've got to be able to celebrate the very, very many achievements of the last Labour government and remember just how important, how radical, how brave some of those things were and how fundamentally they've changed the country, at the same time as recognising that there are lessons to be learned from that era, things to do differently, and actually the context of the world that we'll inherit in 2024 is fundamentally different than the context of the world that the new Labour government inherited in 1997. Just to give you one example, a friend of mine was saying to me, reminding me the other day, that it was 1994, just a few years before the last Labour government came to power, when just as Tony Blair was becoming leader, that the first emails were exchanged between two world leaders. And I'll give you a pop quiz prize for whoever can name them. But I mean, this was a completely different era. Now we live in a world where at the touch of a button, drones can be deployed on the other side of the world. I mean, this is just fundamentally very, very different. So I think it's absolutely right to recognise the minimum wage, the education maintenance allowance, equal marriage. These things mattered, they lasted, they were game changers in constituencies like mine. And we should never shy away from being proud of that and celebrating that. But we can't party like it's 1999 and expect to get into government in 3 years' time. It's just not going to work.
And by the same token, what's your analysis of why Labour under Jeremy Corbyn did so badly?
We had a lot of debate in the leadership contest about this, and it all ended up centering around the manifesto. And by the end of those hustings, those million hustings that we went and did in soulless conference centres, shouting slogans at one another while the audience wasn't allowed to speak. So you can sort of guess what I thought about those hustings. But by the end of those, I just got so frustrated that when somebody asked me what I'd liked and not liked and what I thought had worked and not worked about the manifesto, I just said, I don't think anyone in this country read the manifesto. I think by the time we got to the 2019 election, I think nobody was listening anymore. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think it's partly infighting. You know, I don't think any one faction of the party can bear all of the blame for that. I think it was partly a consequence of the fact that very, very quickly people in constituencies like mine came to feel that we were not careful with their security, whether it was their economic security, whether it's their national security, whether it's their family security. I think there was a sense that, you know, Skripal, I've said this before, played into, that we just didn't love this country and want to stand up for it. And, you know, I've had a bit of stick today, as every time I talk about patriotism, for talking about it as if somehow it's a right-wing concept. 8 years ago, I made a speech to the class think tank about patriotism, where I said, I do not understand how this concept has been so comprehensively captured by the right, pulling together in pursuit of something that you believe in, coming together, finding the common ground. You know, what could be more left-wing than that, actually? You know, patriotism for me is not a narrow value, it's a noble one. It goes out and fights for the things that you believe in, for other people as well as for yourself. I just, you know, I don't understand how we got into that position. So I think there are a whole host of reasons how we got to where we got, and I haven't even mentioned the B word, but, you know, we lost trust. Ultimately that was the thing. We lost the trust of, you know, in our constitution, it says Labour seeks the trust of the people to govern, and we didn't actually. We forgot to seek the trust of the people to govern, and we've got to rebuild that trust.
Lisa, I want to bring in Katie Atkins, because as you were talking, she was talking about the loss of trust in. Well, Katie, tell us where you are and kind of the politics that you see around you.
Sure, yeah. So I live in the Stockton North seat, but I also work in Billingham, which is near Hartlepool and Tees Valley area, which typically was like a proper strong, well, it was a Labour stronghold. And that has, I mean, since the change in the last election, even in like conversation and everything, in the flyers that we get through the doors, it's all Conservative narrative. And I mean, for me, that makes me really, really sad, because I just can't see it in the conversation anymore. And I'm just thinking, like, I mean, I've looked, it was earlier today, I was looking at who was standing for in my seat, and I don't think they have anyone at the moment. And the narrative is just very, very Conservative led. I mean, in Teesside at the moment, there's a lot of regeneration going on, but it's very led by Conservatives. And I think that is really driving a lot of the force. And they are leading a lot of kind of job formation in, it's in the clean energy area as well. There's a lot of stuff going on in the Teesside area when it comes to oil and gas and stuff like that. And yeah, it's very Conservative led.
Thank you, Katie. Lisa, what do you make of that, and what do you make of the arguments around winning back, quote unquote, the red wall?
What I mean, you know, I was just listening, to be honest. I just found it, you know, interesting to hear the view from the front line, or from the coalface, if we're on the energy theme, because you know, the way, one of the problems with when you lose power in areas is that you become less visible, your presence becomes less visible, and then it's even harder to show people the difference that you can make. You know, when I was the Shadow Energy Secretary under Jeremy 4 or 5 years ago, one of the things that we did was to work with Labour councils around the country, because just as the government was rolling back subsidies for solar, was banning new onshore wind, rolling back the sort of clock on the clean energy agenda. At the same time, you had Labour councils around the country and Labour mayors investing in clean energy projects, and they were doing it partly because they believed in climate change, but they were also doing it because they saw it very much as about being able to rebuild municipal socialism, being able to use, you know, Manchester used to have its own power station back in the day. I think Richard Leese is building one again, but They, you know, it generated income that was then spent on building our libraries, our parks, our great municipal assets, and showing people the difference that Labour could make in your area. And so we worked together to show that, taken together, where we were in power in almost every town and city around the country, we were taking, I think it was about 20% off the UK's carbon footprint, even as the national government was rolling it back. And that's a really important story for Labour to tell, because, you know, by 2024, we'll have been out of power for 14 years. At the last election, I sat with 17-year-olds who are about to get the right to vote for the first time, and they couldn't think of anything that Labour had done. When I talked to them about the minimum wage, which is something Ian McCartney, my predecessor here, was deeply involved in, they didn't know what I was talking about, because they'd never known a time when there wasn't a minimum wage. And, you know, we can't just rely on historical examples. We've got to show the difference that Labour can make. So I just think that's a really important thing that that I've just heard. It's something that I'm going to have to look at them.
Lisa, I'm only kind of, because I can see so many people want to speak. I want to go to Mehdi Askaria, and then I'm going to go to Peter Callery on the culture point that was in the chat. Mehdi.
Thank you, James. Hello, Lisa. If I can take you momentarily back to the US foreign policy. Admittedly, the administration been going on for over 2 months. However, it appears to me that they are not sure-footed. We had a debacle at Anchorage, and which did not fill anyone with confidence. And we had an instance that the leader of the West calls another leader of a major country a killer, a murderer. And when you look at the Middle East, for instance, sorry, that is a reference, Biden calling Putin a killer or a murderer. And when we look at the Middle East, we see, with respect to the Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, that there has been hardly any action. And it looks like the administration wishes to rest on Trump administration's actions and laurel, in a sense. As I said, early days, but it doesn't fill one with confidence. But the question, if I may, and I hope James will not be livid with me, the question that I'd like to ask you is, what do you understand from the administration's declaration that they are following a foreign policy for the middle class? That is what they've actually have declared.
Thank you, Mehdi, thank you.
I'll be very brief. Some people interpret that as anti-free trade. Do you subscribe to that? Thank you.
Thanks, Mehdi.
I guess that goes right back to the start, you know, the question that James was posing to me about, you know, is this just a sort of, you know, is this a cover for a protectionist agenda, an anti-globalization agenda, winding the clock back to the 1970s? And I absolutely reject that. I think that there are models of globalization. There's more and more we're seeing, for example, distributional impact of trade deals being noted by leading economists. And we reject the idea that you should support trade deals that don't raise standards and don't support people across the board, that produce benefits for a few and not for the many, to sort of, you know, sloganize it a little bit. So, I mean, and I think that the Biden administration has got a very similar take on that, that you've got to be able, you know, David Miliband once said, when I was first elected as an MP just after Labour had lost power, that, you know, we thought that a rising tide would float all boats, but they didn't. And that is a really important recognition. And that means that things do need to change. It doesn't mean that you just, you know, shut the borders and stop the trade. There are jobs in my constituency. You know, Heinz is the biggest employer here, for example. It's a global company. People in this town really do understand the value of global cooperation. We used to power the world through our mining for goodness sake, you know, we really do understand how much it matters. But we should be working together with our allies in order to raise standards across the board and ensure, most of all, that we don't have these growth models. You know, we've seen it in China, where you've got wages depressed, the ability of domestic Chinese workers to consume the products that they produce, goods produced very cheaply, mass produced, going out onto the global market, and then lowering the wages, the living standards, costing the jobs of workers in countries like the United States. Now, Donald Trump's answer to that was just simply protectionism, although he actually in the end did very little in relation to that agenda. But what if we were to reach out instead and start to work together to raise those standards? We've seen efforts around that, you know, with the way in which we've used trade deals before in order to raise environmental standards. Why couldn't we do the same now? And actually, I think the moment is really right now. I don't think history sort of collides in this way very often. But if you were to see a Labour government in 2024 and a Biden administration, I think you could suddenly see, depending on what's going on in Europe, you could suddenly see a real moment where the world could start to turn a corner. And that's what we're trying to build right now.
Thank you. Can I just pick up on that? And another echo between the US and the UK is around culture in politics. And one of the things that you hear from Kamala Harris is this clarity that for more and more people, particularly younger people, culture even more than economics is politics. And Peter, and forgive me, I'm going to pronounce your name wrong, Peter Calorie, I think it is. Peter, you're there. Do you want to put the point you put in the chat about why this has been a hotter issue for the right than the left?
Okay, so I mean, one way of trying to understand what's going on with this government is it seems to be trying to set traps for Labour of culture war topics. And I mean, Brexit never seems to end, so hostility towards Europe in your area of policy. But also, I was very struck by Stephen Bush's New Statesman's argument that Labour appears to be trying to avoid these culture war topics. And he was suggesting, in terms of the problems around sexual violence and the policing bill, that perhaps a more aggressive approach about talking about linking it with austerity over the last 10 years might be more productive than trying to avoid the fight.
Peter, thank you. Lisa, what do you make of that?
So Keir and I have been talking a lot, as you can imagine, to sister parties around the world over the last year, and obviously talking a great deal to our sister party, the Democrats in the United States. Even before the Biden victory, we were talking to some of Obama's people about the way in which they'd navigated some of those culture wars that we saw in the United States long before we saw the government here pick them up and try to weaponize them here in the UK. That very strongly from both the Obama camp and from the incoming Biden administration and the Biden campaign team is a view that, they will not stop, that division is the playbook which they operate by, and they use division in order to pit people against one another and to shore up their base. It's clearly a tactic that Boris Johnson has decided is going to work for him. He doesn't seem to have any other ideas. And their view is that you have to stand against this. As Michael Walzer says, he wrote a piece called I can't remember, The Great Challenge for the Left, or the Historical Task of the Left, I think it's called. And he said, you never think that the blood-dimmed tide comes only for migrants, it comes for all of us. We all need a centre that holds. And that is the left's historical task, that we have to at once stand on the left and in the centre at the same time. And he said that may be complicated, but that is what we must do. And about what he meant by that was pretty much what Biden did during the campaign. He pushed back very, very strongly against attacks on everything from trans rights and LGBT members of the military to the attacks on the Black Lives Matters movement, and so on and so on. He just would not stand for it, and he was absolutely clear. But what he also didn't do was allow himself to be diverted off his own agenda, which was the concerns of people right across America on the economy in particular and on health. And, some people said, that means you're abandoning the fight, around trans rights. Trans people care about the economy as well. They care about getting a grip on COVID-19. We have to be able to do both of these things simultaneously, or as the Americans put it to us, we have to be able to walk and chew gum. But it's an important lesson for us, I think.
And Lisa, then, will you end by just giving a sense in high and low terms of what the strategy is? A friend of mine sent me the piece of analysis by John Curtis a few weeks ago, kind of arguing about the choice for Labour, about does it sort of go after quote unquote traditional voters, or does it internalise the lessons of Brexit differently? And I suppose there's a friend of mine that really wants Labour to articulate in a pithy, almost sloganeering way what's wrong with the Tories. And you can see the Conservatives positioning themselves as the vaccine party. I'm interested to know how you think Labour will effectively position them. So sort of strategy and slogan as a final thought.
How we position the Tories, or how we position ourselves?
How you position the criticism, the argument against the Tories.
Well, I mean, it was almost framed as a sort of, which voter group are you going to pick and which are you going to write off? And for me, actually, the lesson of the last few decades, watching what's happened in my town, is that once you start writing off entire cohorts of the electorate, you're in a very bad place, not just as a country, but not just as a party, but as a country. It doesn't offer any future. And, my pitch in the leadership contest, something that I've been developing with Angela Rayner, with Rachel Reeves and others over the last few months, is that this settlement that we've got that writes off people and entire communities in this country, that cost Labour a lot of support at the last election, but had been a long, long time coming. That settlement doesn't work for people in other communities either. It doesn't work for people in towns who've seen good jobs depart. Doesn't work for people in cities who've seen huge numbers of people crammed into their cities overheating while towns are underutilised, and all the problems that ensue for that, on pressure on public services, on overcrowded housing, on these huge extremes of inequality that we see, people living side by side, but in different worlds and with different lives. This is a model that just isn't working for the country as a whole. And one thing I would just say is that a lot of the Conservative strategy for the so-called Red Wall seems to be based on a version of communities like mine that I just simply do not recognise. People don't want wave machines to deter asylum seekers. They want good jobs so that their kids have a choice to stay here and work here and contribute to the place that they grew up, if that's what they so choose. People are pragmatic. They don't want to carry on arguing about the EU. They want the result to be respected because they're Democrats, but they also want to make sure that we protect trade and jobs and businesses, companies like Heinz, so that they can stay here and contribute to our town. They don't like nastiness, and that row that the Tories have constantly been trying to stoke about statues just absolutely baffles people in Wigan. People can't understand why they're still talking about it. We got the chance to erect a public statue by public subscription here in Wigan, and the person we chose was Billy Boston. Now, if you don't know who Billy Boston is, shame on you, but he is a legend of rugby league with the right type of rugby, and he was a Wigan legend as well as an England legend, but he's also one of the only Black players of that era. And they tried to characterize our town as racist, as nasty, as xenophobic, but walk into the middle of Wigan and just have a look at what is standing there and how much we love Billy Boston, and that will tell you everything that you need to know. So we're not going to play that game. We're going to go out and speak for the whole of this country. We're going to fight for it, and we're going to earn back their trust.
Well, Lisa, thank you very much indeed. I feel particularly guilty because we run over a couple of minutes, so we've eaten into everyone else's time. Doubly so because I heard that you were hungry, and let's face it, there were certain questions of mine that were long enough that I gave you time to order a pizza in the time that I asked them. So I feel bad that you haven't eaten. I should say, the nature of the thinking is it's an attempt to try and get a better understanding of what's driving the news. And I come away from this with two really kind of big ideas. One is about how you rethink patriotism, but actually the things that you talked about united but not uniform, about on the left and in the centre, there's such interesting ones to sort of see and help you frame the way in which Labour work. So thank you for that. I do have to leave with one final question, though, which is obviously we appreciate the points on Britney. You did raise the Taylor Swift Beyonce question. So for those people who are now thinking to themselves, what is the Lisa Nandy playlist? The best Taylor Swift song and the best Beyonce song, please.
You know, I got into loads of trouble a few years ago because I was asked by Jeremy Vine. I was on his show and he said, you can request a song. I said Taylor Swift, and he said, which one? And I said, what about We Are Never, Ever, Ever Getting Back Together? And it was in the middle of the Labour Party really falling apart. And I got so many calls about it. So I don't want to get myself into trouble. But what about Freedom by Beyonce? Really empowering feminist song. Feels like it's fitting for the moment.
Great, thank you very much, Steve. Lisa Nandy, thank you for your time this evening. I know you've had a long day. Thank you everyone for joining us. We can't give you a round of applause, but we can wave you off in the direction of your dinner. Thanks so much.